that by now all attendees have been allowed to participate. So let me welcome all of you to our 7th episode of the webinar series organized by the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research on Minorities and COVID-19. I'm Roberta Medda-Windischer, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research, and I have the pleasure to moderate the discussion of today's webinar. Our focus of today is to discuss the specific consequences, limitations, discriminatory practices, the impact on Roma populations as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Roma, as you know, is the largest minority group in Europe and are present in virtually all European countries. Under this umbrella term, they comprise millions of individuals and communities, including Sinti, travelers, Calais, gens du voyage, and others. And it's acknowledged that most Roma populations face considerable obstacles to the full enjoyment of their fundamental rights. And we also know that the COVID pandemic has intensified and will intensify these existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. We will discuss these issues with 5 distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them to you. Andrey Ivanov is Project Manager on Roma Integration for the Agency for Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Thanks for joining. Zola Kondur is Vice President of the International Organization Roma Women's Fund, CIVICLI, and National Project Officer for the joint EU Council of Europe program ROMED in Ukraine. Thanks, Zola. Neda Korunovska is Advocacy Manager at the Open Society Roma Initiatives Office. Then we have Zora Popova, an independent policy analyst and minority rights expert, formerly affiliated to ACMI Flensburg. Thanks, Zora. And then we have Vincze, member of the European Parliament, co-chair of the Intergroup for Traditional Minorities, National Communities and Languages in the European Parliament, and also president of the Federal Union of European Nationalities, FUN. Thanks to all of you. Our discussion will last approximately 1 hour, and I encourage all participants from the audience to comment and send their questions through the chat. My colleague Alexandra Tomaselli is the chat moderator of our session today. I would start first with you, Neda, together with Zeljko Jovanovic, you wrote a comprehensive report on Roma in the COVID-19 crisis, covering 6 EU member states. So you are in an ideal position to give us a short overview of major results, especially on access to health and labor, as emerging from your report. So please, Neda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberta. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me first thank the Institute for organizing this webinar and also greet my fellow panelists and all the people that are actually watching the streamline, and we are looking forward to this discussion. As you said, we already published an early warning on the COVID-19 situation based on the data that we collected from the field, from our partners, and we are now publishing upcoming report on the Western Balkans. So in some, unfortunately, the government measures that were implemented as a response to the pandemic fell short to address the specific circumstances that Roma faced the pandemic, both in terms of the health and living conditions and also the earnings or the income generation of Roma. So let me just highlight the major facts. So 2/3 of Roma faced the pandemic without being able to buy prescribed medicine. 30% live in conditions without pipe water. 10% depend on water in the neighborhood to collect the water, and also 1/3 have no access to sewage. The access to statutory mandatory health insurance is also limited across the European Union. For example, 45% of Roma in Bulgaria and 54% in Romania have access to statutory health insurance. And unfortunately, even testing for COVID was conditioned with health insurance coverage in Spain, Bulgaria, and and Hungary, which prevented many Roma for accessing these basic health rights. Of course, there were some positive examples, such was the city of Milan, who conducted oxygen saturation levels and testing in Roma camps in an effort to prevent the outbreak in these settlements. When we see the responses to this pandemic, we see that even the access to water, which is a human right, I would say, was not let's say, tried to solve in a systemic level. There were some exceptions in Romania, in Macedonia, etc., but those were limited responses. Let me move to, because we are short on time, on the employment, and I would love to engage more in the discussion. So I think this is the area that will have the biggest negative consequences, impact of Roma community, because it also affects the Roma who were able to sustain and support their living before the pandemic. However, Roma predominantly work in informal jobs, labor intensive, but pay for job sectors which are low skilled and low wage. And basically they were not able to earn their income because of the restrictive measures, because many of them work in public spaces that were closed down during the pandemic. Additionally, because of informality of their jobs, they were not able to access support measures that were mostly geared towards the formal and a more bigger economy across the countries. So vast majority of Roma, more than 80%, faced the pandemic without earnings to sustain and support their living for more than 1 month. And a survey of 195 Roma entrepreneurs from Romania, Serbia, and Macedonia, conducted by the Roma Entrepreneurship Development Initiative, found that 50% of entrepreneurs said that they would not be able to make their rent or loan payments if the crisis lasts longer than 2 weeks. 60% did not see how they can, they said that they will go bankrupt after 2 months, and 90% would not see any opportunity to generate income in the future. And as I said, the government measures failed to support these workers, except in North Macedonia and one-time support in Albania. And we are already witnessing the negative consequences for Roma, who basically as traders, as workers, were discriminated and excluded. I will give an example, for instance, in Italy. In the aftermath, so the entertainment and the merry-go-round Roma, which is 15,000 people, were not included into the support to the culture industry and the entertainment industry, and etc. And while they could not operate, some of the governments are making now the adjustments. But I have to say that for the first couple of months, this was not the case, and it's still not the case at the level that we need to see it, which in effect puts Roma even in a more disadvantaged position than before the pandemic crisis hit. I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Neda, for this short overview. My second question is to Andrey. We know that the Fundamental Rights Agency has conducted in the last years important surveys on discrimination and ethnic minorities, including Roma, across all European countries. I refer to MEDIS 1 and 2, showing how widespread discrimination against Roma is basically a recurrent reality in most European countries. So considering those surveys, which aspects focusing on Roma minors, children and teenagers, so more generally about their education, will be, in your opinion, more affected in a post-pandemic scenario? The floor is yours, Andrey.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the European Agency for Fundamental Rights is working quite intensively on the issue of deprivation of Roma, and we are now currently in the process of finalizing a study on the impact of COVID-19 epidemic on Roma communities in 15 EU member states. Hopefully It will be ready by somewhere in the beginning of July, end of July. And also looking into the data from our previous surveys, we can have some idea of what is going on in the field. Both the data from the surveys done before and the current research suggest that the pandemic revealed a number of structural problems which were there with the Roma population, which Roma population were affected by, and simply amplified it, augmented it. So these are not problems which were caused by the pandemic. For example, as Neda mentioned, the lack of water, I mean, it's always been there, but the government did not manage or did not want to address it. Simply the pandemic brought these issues at the front of our policy attention. As regards young people and Roma children, I think these are the groups which are among the most severely affected by the pandemic for a number of reasons. First of all, looking at poverty rates, we have higher poverty rates of children living in poor families than the average of the Roma population, which is already tremendously high. At risk of poverty is within 80% of Roma in the countries surveyed by the European Union Minorities and Discrimination Survey in 2016. And among Roma children, the poverty rate is 85%. So it's really much higher than the other groups. But apart from poverty, there is a number of other factors which affect very negatively the development of children. Let me take the issue of education. As we know, in most countries, the government switched to distance learning, and in that case, Roma children were disproportionately affected because for a number of reasons. One is the lack of proper devices or internet access. Roughly 30% of Roma families have internet access. 32% have a personal computer, and 35% have smartphone. But apart from the technological access, there is also a matter of skills, a matter of social distance. You cannot expect children to be learning and effectively participating in the online educational process if they don't have the elementary capacity to separate some space for learning or for doing homework and so on. And this is exactly one of the reasons which they are facing. Roma children, Roma families who don't live in a household that meet minimum standards of rooms according to Eurostat definition is 78% in the EU -9 countries. The share is slightly lower in 6 countries of Western Europe, which were surveyed last year, but still it is an important challenge which needs to be addressed. Finally, the issue of young people, not children, but young people who graduate and are expected to enter into the labor force. They are facing the dual challenge. One is the high share of those who are neither in education nor in employment or training. And this so-called NEET rate is 63% among the Roma before the pandemic. Now we know that with the economic slowdown, these figures will grow up, will shoot up, and again, young people might be disproportionately hit, also because of high informality rate. So the people who are employed in the informal sector and basically are cut off from the standard government support measures, which are usually going to the formalized businesses. So even if the governments want to do something to decrease Roma vulnerability in the labor force, in labor market, and address certain measures to young Roma entering the labor market, the issue of this informality will be dragging these efforts behind. I think I will stop here if there are any, to leave more time for more questions and more detailed analysis.
Thanks a lot, Andrey. My question is to Zola, as we cover young people and children, is to women, is about women. So we all know that also from our previous webinar that was entirely dedicated to women, that the pandemic has amplified and will amplify the gender gap. So my question is about you, Zola, is about Roma women. And my question is, which specific problems Roma women face in the enjoyment of their rights and freedoms in comparison to non-Roma women? And do you see common elements among Roma and non-Roma women in their exclusion and discrimination, a sort of common gender denominator of discrimination on which perhaps a common advocacy platform can be created? Please.
Thank you, Roberta. Well, speaking about Roma women, we have to remember that they face multiple discrimination based on their ethnic origin and their gender. The coronavirus outbreak has widened long-standing exclusion, poverty, and discriminations against Roma women. And this certainly applies to access to healthcare, employment, education, security, access to social services, and I would say access to water. For example, in Ukraine, Roma women without IDs or permanent place of registration, unable to sign formal agreements with the family doctors who are the first point of contact in case of a suspected COVID-19 infection. Undocumented Roma women and men are deprived of access to formal employment, pensions, and social security, including unemployment benefits or benefits for families with low income and benefits for children. The quarantine measures having dramatic economic consequences on Roma women who are often involved in temporary or informal jobs. The vast majority of Roma women have lost their main sources of income because of the closure of local markets and small businesses. And the only source for income for many families during the pandemic is social benefits or humanitarian support, which is not usually insufficient to cover all the needs. With the school closed and switching to online education, children have to rely on homeschooling and good internet connection, which is not always the case. Low-educated or illiterate mothers cannot provide necessary support. These obstacles facing Roma children in access to education during the quarantine is likely to widen the existing gap in the educational level, especially for Romani girls who may not return to schools. And having all this information from the Roma mediators, community action groups, and local Roma NGOs and local authorities in full compliance with the Council of Europe's Strategic Action Plan for Roma and Travelers Inclusion, the organization has adjusted some of the plan's activities, turning them into immediate response and support measures in the fields of sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare in order to alleviate the consequences of the crisis for the most vulnerable women, men, and children. Substantial support was organized in the context of relevant joint programs between the European Union and the Council of Europe, such as In School, Just Rome, Romact, and Romected, and of course, Council of Europe Action Plan for Ukraine. And to answer your question about the common advocacy platform, I think a lot can be done here, but of course we can work or cooperate on political and civic participation for women, national minorities, women empowerment. economic development, standing consultative mechanism with women's organizations to ensure that the needs and priorities directly influence COVID-19 response efforts. And maybe we can discuss some other priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Zola. Now a question to Zora. My question is about mutual trust. We all know that a deficit of mutual trust and dialogue is a recurrent problem in many European countries in the relation between public authorities and part of non-Roma population and many Roma communities. So my question, how do you evaluate the impact of the pandemic and the Roma community from this perspective, so the perspective of mutual trust? And a question that is also has been also raised in the chat by Ion Duminica. How stigmatization, hate speech, especially through social media, scapegoating emerging during the pandemic are impacting on this fragile intergroup Roma and non-Roma relationship? Is there a way to somehow prevent hate speech through social online networks? Please, Zora.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Eurac for putting these webinars together and for including the Roma topic in them as well. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the situation is very interesting. It was and still it is very interesting because the COVID-19 pandemic became, from in my perspective, a test for the Roma integration policies all over Europe. Revealing a number of shortfalls and number of outstanding issues and challenges, but also some positive approaches that can be considered and developed into policies probably in the future. The lack of trust emerged very significantly, and I'll give the example of Bulgaria. As you all know, there were many Roma neighborhoods locked down and with checkpoints installed so that people were kept inside, not being able to move freely, and for the fact they lost jobs and the situation was really difficult for them. That was, of course, articulated as a measure against the spread of the epidemic. At the same time, however, there was this feeling, without being articulated openly, that it is a type of a discriminatory measure. But at the same time, the lack of trust emerged from the other side. And it was, there was another case when a Roma person literally ran away from a hospital and came back to their own home village, resulting in blockage of the village and so on. But again, it shows to me, I mean, I'm here, don't take me wrong, I'm not blaming on the Roma person running away from the hospital, but I'm using the example to show that apparently the lack of trust is mutual. So communities do not trust authorities that they will be taken, that proper care will be taken, and authorities do not do not trust communities that the measures that are imposed will be followed. However, there was this, in fact, this also revealed the significant communication gap that still exists, and that the role of mediators is still highly important, because without the mediators, literally no message could have been transferred and understood by the individuals belonging to Roma communities. And on many occasions, mediators really played a very important role in explaining all the details, why there are these measures, how to people need to react, what to do, and so forth, and so on and so forth. But this again, no matter how important the role of the mediators is, it shows that there is no direct communication, that there is still this person that really governments and communities depend on to establish this connection in between the two groups, let's say. At the same time, I would say that to cover the question about the media and the image of Roma people in media, I would say that for some time in the beginning of the pandemic, Roma were kind of forgotten, in my opinion. Of course, you can provide evidences that it was not the case, but they were, in a way, the policy, the governments literally, in a way, just forgot that there are these communities there. And this is also, so the media negative kind of comments and criticism against Roma were not so intensive in the media over the last couple of months. Nowadays, they started emerging again, but in the beginning, there was not so many of them. However, why I'm saying that Roma communities were forgotten, education is exactly the example. I mean, immediately, okay, there were some measures to introduce the distance learning, but of course, how these people could cover and how these children can attend school if they have no equipment. Why I'm saying that at the same time, the pandemic revealed some positive approaches. It is, for example, again, in Bulgaria, there were a couple of municipalities introducing a very interesting approach to the education, distributing, like using the social workers to disseminate paper printed materials among the families, and the next day to collect the written homework and so on. Of course, this is not the best example, and probably it has not been fully efficient, but still it is something to try to address the situation. And the overall view that I have on the situation is that what is needed is that governments take into consideration exactly kind of this situation provided really good mechanism to evaluate how good the integration policies were and where the shortfalls are. And I'm not speaking here about the structural problems and the structural challenges, but all these challenges that can be addressed by certain policy measures. And I will stop here, exactly not to take more time and to allow the people to present as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Zora, and thanks for even if just briefly mention also some positive practices or examples. And this leads me to my question to Lorant about the opportunity and how this crisis can be used as an opportunity. So in the economy, for example, a slogan is often used which says, "Never let a crisis go to waste," referring to the fact that the crisis should be used as an opportunity to do things you think you could not do before. Now, after the pan-European decade on Roma inclusion that was supposed to eradicate poverty and bring tangible improvement in the lives of the Roma population in Europe, and 10 years after the adoption of the EU Roma strategy, which lessons, in your opinion, can we learn from these ambitious initiatives that can serve in the post-pandemic scenario to transform effectively a crisis into an opportunity, if this is actually possible? Lorant, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberta, for the question, and I say hello to the participants and all those who follow us. Just as a quick reaction to the remarks of other colleagues before entering into the details of your question. I think all that has been said is valid. They are important findings. I would like to stress, however, that we try to see the Roma question as not one large problem, because the Roma communities themselves are not uniform. We cannot say that there is a large Roma community in the EU scattered in the different countries and in Europe. But these are very specific groups. Even locally, we can divide them in several groups. So it is an important challenge to speak about the Roma with their specific needs. And here we can draw also the lines on the map, because you made reference to Roma in Eastern European countries and those neighboring the EU. We can make different references or problems regarding Roma in Central Europe, and then another pack of problems regarding Roma in Western European states, namely anti-Gypsyism, racism, and so on. And all these need to be tackled a bit separately. Now, I think it is a coincidence more that in the European Parliament, the evaluation of the decades since the national Roma integration strategies are in place take place in this period. So it is coinciding with the pandemic, I mean, but the work has started, and the Fundamental Rights Agency provided a lot of information, study on the situation of Roma, and shortly put, we need to acknowledge that the situation of Roma did not improve during this decade. Even in some aspects, it is worse than it has been before. And then the question is obvious: what can we do to change it? How could be a decade of Roma inclusion become really practical? How can the EU institutions convince member states to do more? Because as far as this decade was, some proposals have been made at EU level, a coordination has been made, but finally the member states were the ones to take the measures, and these measures did not bring the necessary results. This pandemic also showed us that it is a very strong discrimination against Roma, but minorities in general. The FUN and the Minority Intergroup of the European Parliament had a study on the impact of the COVID on the use of languages. And we discovered that more than half of the minorities had no information on their mother tongue about the COVID in general, about healthcare information, emergency hotline in their own language, education in the mother tongue, as it was already mentioned. And then we have a totally new layer on Roma, which adds even more problems when we speak about access to educational material, lack of water, and so on. Of course, you cannot wash your hands as often as possible when you don't even have running tap water in your community. So I think the COVID pandemic only showed this problem even more. It showed where this whole system has its problems. And I am happy to be part of the group of members in the European Parliament who contribute to this report that will be already voted in July in the LIBE committee, and probably in September in the plenary of the European Parliament, because we need to exactly intervene in the front of the questions that you raised: inclusive education, the lack of good national programs, then about early school dropout rate of Roma, the different social issues, housing, the lack of identity paper for many Roma still, and so on, better access to the labor market, vocational education, adult education, and this anti-discrimination legislation, which should be enabled. Now also with the COVID, we could see that in Western Europe, they were examples of Roma discrimination. I think that the politicians are ready. I mean, in the European Parliament, I can see that the political groups are very active when they want to tackle the Roma problems. Also, the EPP group that I'm part of adopted just now a policy paper on Roma that shows really the different level where more intervention is needed. And I am hopeful that we will be able to provide more in the next decade than it was in the previous one. Maybe we need more stronger legal act. It is not enough to just coordinate on the EU level, but we need a directive on the Roma inclusion. I'm always saying you will see the problem, the surface at local level, and you are able to draw the conclusions. But if you want to change something, it has to start from the legislation, from the lawmaking. And I hope that from this point of view, the EU will be able to provide more in the upcoming period. So I will stop here now, and then we can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Laurent. And I have now selected, with the help of my colleague Alexandra, a number of questions that I'm going to put on the table. There are many, and I will then follow the order that we follow. I mean, that we use, that we apply until now. And so it's up to you. Pick up the question that you feel like or more related to. You can say something meaningful. Basically, you can reply. There is a first question on by Jon Duminica again on multiple stigma. Sorry, is by Aliona Kazanska. Sorry, the sort of multiple stigma that Roma may experience being Roma and be also positive, COVID positive. So it is a sort of multiple problem in comparison to other non-Roma population. Then there is a question perhaps to Andrey on access to online education. You mentioned it, but there are other questions whether this can actually be considered a sort of formal education at all, because there was an example in Moldavia where most all Roma population basically were not able to access basically online education. Then a question by Sam Beck. And this was partly addressed by Lorant about whether there are data on the impact of the COVID on diverse Roma groups. So different conditions, different data in different situations. And by Sam, another question to the panelists. Whether there are, according to your knowledge, any Roma organizations providing support and resources to vulnerable Roma, so Roma to Roma, basically. And then a question by Linda Pieper, who is from the is a state chancellery land from the state chancellery land Schleswig-Holstein, about the role of mediators that was raised by Zora. But perhaps also Zola can say something because it's linked to the project ROMED. Is this a promising idea? What is a sort of balance on mediation? Other questions are coming, but I will stop here. Please, first Neda, then Andrey, Zora, and Lorant. Neda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me reflect on some of the questions and comments by the panelists. First, on the role of the Roma NGOs and activists, I think this was the crucial role that they played during the pandemic, especially in the early years. And I think in our report also we are showcasing that the first support to the Roma settlements was done by Roma communities and the Roma diaspora, who self-organizes and provided the urgent need. And the second most important role was the influence towards the packages in food and hygiene packages that were actually channeled to the vulnerable population, and the Roma activists and NGO were really crucial in actually informing this list and these policies and including Roma into the list of the beneficiaries. The second question, issue I wanted to touch upon is the scapegoating of Roma, the mutual trust and the information sharing. I think we've seen during the pandemic that the vulnerability, how Roma were used to scapegoat, to portray them as citizens that are not fulfilling or respecting the rules, and that they are potentially the cause or the epicenter for the spread of the virus. And we've seen that this was not the case, and unfortunately in some Roma settlements we see more presence of police and security forces than of health workers, which just shows the failure of the systems to actually protect its own citizens. And this is, I think, a bigger issue because, as Ms. Ivanov said, the pandemic just brought to the light the problems Roma face daily, and the Roma community is aware in the past decades and centuries. And what it showed is that nothing has been changed. For the first time, the mainstream population cared, or at least was in the focus, because it perceived this condition as a health risk as a risk to the whole population. And I think this is where the opportunity can come, if we can use this to actually solve the problem. But it's very telling that from the European Union funds that were earmarked for Roma, 1.6 billion, 500 million are still not decided. So I just want to comment that the situation hasn't changed. It's not because the policies have failed, but because there was a very little intervention from the side of the governments to actually change the situation, and the public investments into improvement of the Roma settlements, formalizing the informality, and really improving in the infrastructure and education, etc., was very limited. And to point on the mediators, I think if Roma are part of the public administration, are employed as social workers, teachers, health professionals, etc., this mistrust that exists and the mistreatment, I think, will gradually disappear. And this is something that we are seeing as crucial for the way forward. I will stop here and come back later.
Thanks, Neda. Andrey, please.
Thank you very much.
You prefer.
Very briefly on two issues. I will touch a little bit on this issue of trust because it's also related to the access to education. I think we should look also in this phenomenon in its dynamics, because it was changing. Initially, all over the place, there was this instinctive reaction from the governments and the mainstream population to see Roma as the source of possible contagion from, particularly from Roma who were returning when Western Europe, working in Italy, Spain, Germany, and other countries which had high rate of epidemic. But gradually, there was, at least in some countries, change in these attitudes, and there were cases when Roma were seen as a group at risk, and not as a group a source of threat. So we should also keep in mind this positive element, which might be on which we might build in the future. One example of such country is Slovakia, which dramatically changed its rhetoric and the approach of the government to the very issue. Of course, it was linked to a change of government. Still, the policies are there. And now coming to the direct issue of access to online education, what the experience and our evidence shows is that it is not just about technical infrastructure, but most of all about skills, about opportunities to use this infrastructure, even if it is in place. Some countries, like I think Neda mentioned Bulgaria, yes, Bulgaria, Romania, other countries try to compensate for this lack of technical infrastructure. For example, establishing free Wi-Fi hotspots in Roma settlements, providing devices involving Roma organizations to distribute the devices. But still, the social skills were slowly building up, and you cannot catch up just providing devices to hundreds of Roma children and tick the box that the issue has been solved. And I think here we are looking into the future. We need to bear in mind this momentum, which is still evolving. I think that for the next year, at least in the short run, we need to be ready to do, the governments, the societies need to be ready to take some extraordinary measures to compensate for the possible risk of dropping out of children who did not manage to participate effectively in the distance learning process. Just one figure, the share of early school leavers from education. This is those children or young people who have completed at most lower secondary education is 72% in the 9 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. It is 66% in Western European 6 member states which were surveyed last year, but still it is very, very high. And you can reasonably expect that this year, due to this gap in the online education, access to education, this share will rise further. further, which means that there will be a whole group of people, a cohort of children who will be with limited access to higher education, skills, and later on in the low access to the labor market. I will stop here. The point is there are some small elements of good examples. We need to build on that so that it is systemically mainstreamed into policies.
Thanks a lot, Andrey. You replied partly also to a question that was raised by Rosena Zenov on access to education and the problem of training rather than, or not only a problem of equipment. Now the floor is to Zola. I would ask all the three of you, the last three of you, to be very concise so that we can perhaps in the last minutes also have the last round for the future recommendations. Please, Zola.
Okay, I think that the situation with the coronavirus showed us the importance of the work of the Roma mediators in different European countries. For example, in Ukraine, the Roma mediators were the first one to contact the Roma communities, women, especially to explain about the measures, preventive measures of the coronavirus. They translated the information into Romani language. They were the first one to provide, to help to disseminate the sanitarian kits, the mask and the sanitizers. For example, I have just in front of me the case when in the framework of Roma program, the community action group or community activists in Bulgaria addressed a special letter, for example, to mayor of the Sliven city, highlighting the situation of 200 Roma people in need and in a vulnerable situation. And after that, as a result of this letter and negotiations, 200 people received access to public canteen program, which is also very important in this situation when people do not have any income. And of course, the mediators in many European countries are the first one and the main partners of health institutions, social institutions, to cooperate and help to prevent the dissemination of the coronavirus. I think also for Ukraine, we are working a lot and doing our efforts to recognize the role and the profession of the Roma mediators, because it's not in all the countries recognized already, but I think this situation is exactly show us the importance of the role of these people.
Thanks a lot. Zora, please.
Okay, quickly to mention about the data, I cannot speak about the non-EU countries, but for example, in Bulgaria, that was interesting for me, of course, and positive that no ethnically segregated data was has been provided during the crisis, and only number of infected and positive people have been reported on a daily basis. On a very random cases, it was established that this person, that person is from Roma origin, but it came from media, not from kind of a public authorities. In generally, there was no this division, and so that is why, but I think this is first of all positive issue, because exactly there should not be like the blame game and okay, Roma people, they're, you know, kind of infecting the mainstream societies and so on. So that was not the case in this particular situation, which I think it's good. I would like to disagree with Ms. Korunovska that it's not a failure of policies, because structural challenges are there, and it is very difficult to resolve, you know, the issue with housing, with equipment, with IT skills, and it cannot happen overnight. And unfortunately, I'm sure it is okay, it is the first crisis, but I'm sure it will not be the last. And what if in a couple of months or in next year we have another crisis of the type. So there won't be still computers installed, there won't be still money enough, but we need to make sure that these children, especially I'm speaking now about education, would have access to education in one or another way. So alternative approaches need to be solved. Also, lack of jobs. I mean, many people during the being locked in the neighborhoods, they lost their jobs because employers just needed employees to work for them. And here again, it's a policy failure, because at this very time when the government locked the neighborhoods, they could have said no person can be fired for no show up or something like that. But this has not been put in place. So there are many, how to say, exactly, if governments are thinking exactly with sensitivity towards like people in need, vulnerable groups, Roma, then probably there could be many kind of approaches to be found. And finally, just very quickly to mention that in my perspective, the failure was on national level, not on municipality level, on local community level, because in different communities, for example, in Bulgaria, again, there were different measures in place. As Andrey mentioned, some of them installed free Wi-Fi for the Roma neighborhoods. But for example, in small city of Vincze, the local school decided to work throughout the summer for the first and second grade of children, which are predominantly Roma children, so that they managed to catch up in open air school under some tents, so that they are able to continue the next school year without being without dropping out. So there are positive measures, and that's why I'm always interested in them, because on the basis of these positive initiatives, some policies can be built and probably spread all over and having some positive effect in overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Zora. Lorant, again, pick up your any questions from the audience that I raised before, so that we can then a very last round, and then really at the end you will have a few seconds.
Thank you. Yes, I would insist on best practices because we heard some of those, just to show that the situation is not desperate. It's not a hope that we should lose, but to look at the positive examples and then build up from that. I could see in many municipalities in Romania during this confinement period how the local community find the means to help the most vulnerable, those who were not able to have food, especially Roma communities, my city. I could see how NGOs quickly found funding and were able to cook hot meals for the people for several days when they were not able to provide any means to buy food and so on. I would raise also the issue of the Roma to Roma support. The Sinti and Roma organization from Germany was the first one to raise their voice against anti-discrimination in relation with the COVID, and we published as when their strong voice. I would like to show how good examples from European states can be transposed in good solutions in the Western Balkans. And we had this program in Bijeljina in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where together with the Land Schleswig-Holstein, federal government, Germany, and the ECMI, we created the position of minority commissioner in this small municipality, which was able to act as a mediator. And the role of the mediators is really important. Either they are hired by the municipality or they are working for the NGOs, but it is essential that they are part of the Roma community, so that they change a bit the leadership and they are able to speak on behalf of the group. And here I think Roma involvement in politics and their representativity is essential, because if they are part of the decision making, then those lawmaking processes will be able to be channeled into good solutions also for the Roma communities. I think we should better disseminate the best practices in the field of Roma, next to the studies that show, you know, that Europe somehow failed in providing better policies for the Roma groups.
Thanks a lot, Lorana. You somehow replied also to my last question, that is about the future scenario. So a sort of, I would like to ask you a sort of very concise, in a sort of keyword, last word recommendation, a sort of slogan on the way forward for a better future for the Roma community. But really, I think, Laura, you already said best practice. Really, in a few words, Neda.
Thank you. I think the potential and the hope for future is Roma themselves. They're the youngest, most vibrant minority in Europe, and in aging Europe, I think it's a source that so far has been underutilized. And if the national states actually see Roma as the potential, I think then this is the hope for future. But in order to utilize this potential, we need to have a better policies and a better investments in education, in vocational training, to be able and support Roma entrepreneurs. And for that, I think it's not enough to have measures only on national level. I think there is a need for a complementary instrument at the EU level that will work directly with I agree with local governments who have been shown to be more sensitive in that. And I would like to echo second the point by Mr. Lorant Vincze about the political participation. And I can share the positive example in North Macedonia, which has the highest number of Roma in politics, in decision-making positions, but also in civil servants. And they have implemented a plethora of measures, from supporting informal workers, increasing utility costs, stopping payments of loans, not only from financial institutions, but also non-financial institutions. So we can see there is a hope. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Neda. This was not a slogan, but it's okay. Andrey and the others, please be short, very concise, really a slogan. Few key words.
My slogan would be focus on local level, provide the people in the communities with opportunities to decide and actively shape their own lives and destiny, and make everything possible so that all these efforts at local level bring results. I think participation is critical, and one of the reasons why in the last months Roma health mediators are so prominently visible is because in many cases there was nobody else, and I think this is a huge lesson learned.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrey. Zola?
Okay, well, I think about active participation in decision making, and we have excellent examples in ROMED and Roma Active programs in different countries. Then I fully agree about political participation, but here I would add of Romani women, including, and men, of course, and effective policies at national level, but also at local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Zora?
Yeah,
Yes,
the slogan is that I'm very much hoping to see in the nearest future analysis of the shortfalls on a political level, and joint decision making together with communities on how these problems that were existing nowadays can be avoided next time, because next time can come sooner than later, and the people, communities and governments need to be prepared to act together to resolve these issues.
Yeah. Thank you, Zora. Lorant, in addition to the best practice,
I would say education as the last word, because I think the only way to save the Roma children getting out from this extreme intergenerational poverty, when it is the case, then it's through education. And education also for the majority to overcome prejudices and be more empathic towards these groups. So I think we should build on that in the future.
Thank you very much to all of you for being so concise into this very complex matter. We are now at the end of our discussion. I would like to conclude by saying Roma lives matter. We should launch this sort of slogan in Europe, perhaps, and beyond Europe. I wish to thank all our panelists, all of you from the audience who have attended and sent your comments through the chat. A special thank to the colleagues of the Institute for Minority Rights who have made this webinar possible, in particular Johanna Mitterhofer and Alexandra Tomaselli, who today has collected the questions from the chat. I wish also to recall that the webinars are recorded and you can find them in the website of the Institute for Minority Rights and on YouTube. And I invite all of you to participate to our next webinar on the 30th of June at 3 p.m. on security in times of COVID-19. I hope you enjoyed the discussion of today. Thanks again to all of you, particularly to our panelists, and goodbye.